Hi everyone. This first video is going to introduce you to the Maya interface. Now the first thing you're going to notice is this menu bar at the top. And we want to make sure we're on modeling here. When you're doing different things in Maya, you can switch to, let's say, animation or rendering, and each one has custom menus, but let's make sure we're on modeling. And the first thing we're going to do is create a polygon cube. And so make sure go to Create, Polygon Primitives, and make sure Interactive Creation is unchecked. And then we're going to check Cube. So the cube appears in the middle of the screen like this. And don't worry if your background is slightly different than me. You can change the background color by pressing Alt-B. And then you can cycle through. I like this gradient because it helps me see a little better. So let's say we also want to be in shaded mode, so click this button. If a lot of you may see this, so let's click this to switch to shaded, and let's also turn on edges here. Now you're going to want to work with, let's say, your left hand on the left side of the keyboard and your right hand on the mouse. And a lot of combinations, a lot of controls in Maya are used as keyboard combinations with both the mouse and the keyboard. So let's say to zoom in, you're going to press Alt and right click on the mouse and then roll your mouse forward and backwards to zoom in. To rotate, you're going to want to hold down Alt and press left mouse button, and that rotates the screen. And finally, when you hold down Alt and middle mouse button, it pans. So let's zoom in a little on this and select our object, and we can zoom out a little bit. And I like, sometimes you lose track of your model. You can press F on your keyboard to zoom back in again. No matter where you are in the scene, if you press F, it'll zoom back into the object you have selected. So with our polycube selected, let's press W to bring up the move tool. And we can click and drag along these arrows to move our cube around. We can press E on the keyboard to bring up our rotation tool. And you click and drag on these handles, on these rings, to rotate the cube along the rings. Clicking on the outside sphere will rotate it in that direction. And then finally, pressing R on the keyboard will bring up the scale tool. Clicking on this middle cube will scale the entire cube up uniformly. Clicking and dragging this green cube will scale it in this direction, and this blue cube will scale it in this direction. Now clicking this shape here will scale it up in both of these directions at the same time. And this one will use both of these directions at the same time. So the whole time we've been rotating and scaling our cube, these numbers on the right have been updating, and this is called our channel box. And the channel box holds all the important parameters that have to do with our p-cube in it, such as the scale, where we can go in and actually change the number. Let's change them all back to 1. So we click the field and press 1. Click the next field, left click and press 1. And finally Z, click 1. And this should change the cube back to the original size. For instance, this also works with move. If we select the cube and press W again and move the cube out somewhere over here, you can see this number updating here. Now if we go in and manually turn the numbers back to 0, 0, and 0, that resets the cube position back to its original state. So why don't we make sure our p-cube is selected and change all the rotate parameters back to 0. 0, tab, 0, tab, 0, tab. let's expand this polycube input. Under subdivision width, let's change these next three to 3, 3, and 3. As you can see, this is giving us more edges and faces on our cube, which will come in handy later. So let's move this cube out of the way by pressing W and sliding it a little. And let's go up to Create Polygon Primitives Cylinder. Now make sure interactive creation, let's turn that on this time. So you'll turn it on, but now let's go back to Create Polygon Primitives Cylinder, and this time it'll ask you to drag and then pull up like this. And that's the difference. That's just interactive versus automatically appearing in the center for you. So sometimes you want to use one and sometimes you want to use the other. For the most part, let's leave it on interactive creation for the rest of this tutorial. Now we have this cylinder, and we can go into our channel box here, and we can do things like let's add some more subdivisions so this appears a little smoother. Let's go from 20 to 40. So when we change that number, you can see that there's more edges. Or you can turn it maybe all the way up to 60. And maybe we can scale it back down and rotate it a little. And move it over to the side as well. Why don't we go up to Create again? Now this time let's go to Polygon Primitives and go to Platonic Solids, but then go to this, click this square, which is actually going to bring up the options menu for that command, Platonic Solids. And so now it's going to ask what kind of platonic solid. And so down here, let's switch to icosahedron, Z up, and we're going to click and drag, and it's going to make something like that. So why don't we move this out of the way a little bit and scale it down by pressing R and clicking and dragging. We'll move it away a little bit more. So now let's create a polygon by clicking this icon here, which is the same as going up to Create Polygon Primitives Cube. And so we click and drag, and then we drag up to make the cube. Now let's take a moment to talk about the different display modes that Maya has and the keyboard shortcuts that enable them. So by default, everything is shown in the viewport unsmoothed, and so that's when you select an object and press 1, down here it'll say display smoothness 1. Now if you select it and press 3, however, it shows it smoothed, and this comes in handy when you're modeling organic objects. Pressing 4 displays the wireframe of the object, and pressing 5 displays the smoothed, shaded version of the object. So you can also go to 1 and then press 4 to show the wireframe, or you can press 3 and then press 5 to show the smooth version, the shaded version. The other display mode I didn't mention was pressing 2, which will display a wireframe of the unsmoothed with a shaded version of the smoothed object. So why don't you practice moving around the different modes? It's just pressing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the keyboard. And all of these various modes come in handy when you're modeling objects. Sometimes you want to see things a different way to get a better look at a certain detail, or sometimes you want to show it simplified and blocky. It all depends on what you're modeling, and we're going to get more into this as we move along in the course. So let's select the icosahedron in the cube by pressing Shift left click to select multiple objects. You'll see both of them highlight. If you press Control H, this will hide it. If you press Control Shift H, that will unhide it. Selecting an object and pressing Alt H will isolate it, and Control Shift H will reveal all the objects again. Occasionally, you'll want to display all. So let's say if I Alt H into this, you can also go to Display, Show All, and that'll display everything again. So next I want to show you the outliner, which is located here by pressing this icon. The outliner is a list of every object in the scene in the order that they were created. These first 4 objects are the cameras that we'll get into next. The next 4 objects are the 4 objects that we've created in the scene already. This P cube, when you select it here, you notice it gets selected there. You select it here, the cylinder here, it gets selected there, and so on. And they're listed in the order that we made them, and then there's also some default lights in here that aren't so important. The next thing we're going to talk about is our camera views, which can be located here by pressing this panel layout button. So if you press it, we go into our 4 views. By default, you should have a top, a perspective, a front, and a side. And each of these is a different view of the model. To full screen one of the views, you move your cursor over to that square and you press spacebar. And then you press spacebar again to pop out. Spacebar. It's super easy. Just make sure, sometimes it won't register that your mouse is over there, so sometimes you have to click somewhere in the window and then you press spacebar. So each of these views comes in handy when you're modeling an object and you need to see it from a specific angle. But for the most part, we're going to stick with perspective for now. So let's press spacebar and pop back into perspective view. So now that we're back in perspective view, let's make sure that this sphere is selected. Let's press 1 to switch it back to the unsmoothed cube version. Let's bring up our outliner again by pressing this button. And I wanted to also point out that in this outliner we can rename our shapes to names that we can keep track of in case we have a lot of shapes in our scene. So we double click the name and then you type in the name that you want. So let's just call this my cube. Enter. And so from now on, in the rest of the scene, like let's say if we go over to our channel box here, that shape is called my cube from now on. So you can go through and rename all these shapes to something more specific. So let's call this one icosahedron, and so on. And we can go in and rename all these shapes. If you select this cube, all these parameters are still changeable, so we can change these to 555 and rename this to first cube. Enter. So let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into the next section.